So I was talking with a colleague today, and we were talking about um, infant baptism and some of the arguments used for infant baptism and against infant baptism. And our discussion was kind of interesting because we started talking about two things that I think often are overlooked in this debate. Um, and I will just do this. I think for me, if you ask me, like, what would be the biggest arguments for infant baptism, I think in my mind, there are three things that convince me to support infant baptism. And the first, for me, is this that the first explicit baptism in the Bible is, according to Paul, being baptized into Moses. So he connects the story of Israel being baptized, and that text explicitly includes infant children. Um, of course, the very well known Reformed argument that there's a parallel between circumcision and baptism in Colossians, and since circumcision was demanded for male infants of the Old Testament believers, so too the initiating rite is applied to all, and so the children of believers should be baptized. And then, for me, this third argument is like the one that convinced me, hey, the tradition I was brought up in may have misrepresented the evidence, because the connection and the practice of infant baptism was the position of the early church according to the church's most able interpreters. So just in a minute or two, just point out this quote from Philip Schaff, and this is from his History of the Christian Church, Volume 2, and this is on page 259. Philip Schaff, the editor of the 38-volume Church Fathers, this is what he writes: among the fathers, Tertullian himself not excepted, for he combats only the expediency, there is not a single voice against the lawfulness and the apostolic origin of infant baptism. No time can be fixed at which it was first introduced. Now, I'm not an expert in church history. Biblical theology is my field. But I know that Philip Schaff is an immense figure in church history and would know those writings as well as anyone would, since he was the editor of the 38-volume set. And he says there's not one single voice against its lawfulness. Now, people said, oh, defer, because of sin, and do it right before death. That's granted, but in terms of the lawfulness of baptizing infants, and that practice was apostolic in origin, Philip Schaff makes the argument that there's not one single voice among the church fathers. And what that means is, if Schaff is true, then the argument for believers only baptism, or the church I grew up, follow the Lord in believers baptism, that sounds very robust. But if in fact that argument was an argument unrecognizable among the early church fathers, that's a problem for me. Augustine, in his work on baptism against the Donatist, and this is 4:24:31, Augustine, who you would think would know a little bit about the practice of the church, Augustine says what the universal church holds, not what the universal church held, not instituted or invented by councils, but as something always held, is most correctly believed to be handed down by apostolic authority. And that's in the argument about baptism. Even earlier, we go to Origen. May not agree with everything Origen said, but you would think he would know a little bit about church practice and church history, being so early. He says, according to the usage of the church, baptism is given even to infants. So to argue that it was the Lord's intent to exclude infants from baptism, that's starting to become a much more difficult argument, at least in my opinion. There are other passages. I have to admit that I'm with Calvin here. It wouldn't matter what all the church councils said. If you can prove something from Scripture, then we believe Scripture, not basing our doctrine first and foremost on the creeds, although I agree with the ecumenical creeds. But I think Calvin's right. Show me in Scripture. And often I've heard people say, as I've thought through this debate over the years, there isn't a single example in the Bible of an infant baptism. And for a long time, that seemed very powerful to me, but it's simply not true. In fact, the very first baptism recorded includes the baptism of children and even the baptism of little ones. I wish I had taken time to put the Hebrew up. Well, we can probably pull up, probably accordance would be very easy to use here. If you just give me 1 second. So this is 10:24. So if we come here, Exodus 10:24, what we see is here, this word, your children, and taf, it's your infants. And let's see what it says in the Septuagint. I'm not seeing right away how they're translating. Leave your sheep and your ox, and your baggage. So they're translating that differently, but clearly it's children or infant, and you can see in the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, David Klein's work at Sheffield, and you can see how the ESV is translating it. This passage says that the people who crossed the Red Sea included infants, and it's clear, not on the authority of a commentator, but on the authority of an apostle, that event is a baptism. And so to make the argument that there are no examples in the Bible of infant baptism, to me, that argument doesn't seem to be true. So I'll be interested to see what you think. It's always nice to have a polite dialogue. Trust the Lord will bless all of us in our endeavors to be under the Bible and not over the Bible. So look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks.